Tom, what would you say were the three biggest events that shaped the world of Jesus and the apostles?
I think the first thing that shaped their world was to go back and see what happened when Alexander the Great conquered the whole of what we call the ancient Near East, including, of course, centrally the Holy Land, the land of Judea, Palestine. And as a result of his conquests, the whole of that enormous, vast area not only learned to speak Greek, but they were infected by Greek culture, and they started to think in quite different ways. And Alexander and his successors kind of forced that on the whole of the area down as far as south as Egypt and as far east as almost India. And then after that, there was a great Syrian king called Antiochus Epiphanes at the start of the 2nd century BC, and he came to extend his empire southwards. He marched down and took Jerusalem and desecrated the temple and made it impossible for loyal Jews to worship there. And so there was then a 3-year revolutionary movement led by the Maccabean family. And they, in those 3 years, defeated Antiochus Epiphanes. They cleansed the temple, and that was enough actually to establish him and his family as putative royal house for the next 100+ years. And so we can see already events which are shaping the consciousness of Jewish people at the time of Jesus, because they were all thinking, that's what we want to happen, only this time we want it really to last and really to work. And so when the Romans came in, which was in the middle of the 1st century BC, when Pompey took Jerusalem in 63 BC, and then after that, when Octavian, who became Augustus, became the first Roman emperor, then Judea became part of the Roman Empire and was taxed and was ruled and so on. And there were long memories of these wave upon wave of imperial, ambitious, pagan overtaking of the local Judean culture. It was that context within which we can understand the aspirations of Jesus and his contemporaries, that one day God would come and do finally what they'd always wanted him to do, what it said in the Psalms and the prophets that he would do. So as the Jewish people of Jesus' day looked back and thought about who they were and what they were praying for and so on, they wanted their God to come back and do something which would enable their culture to flourish, not the Greek one that had been imposed on them. They wanted their religion, their temple, to be cleansed once and for all, so that God and his people would finally get it together. And they wanted, above all, their God to come and to be king, so that instead of Caesar as Lord over them, they would have their one true God instead. In order to understand the New Testament, we have to understand how the Jews of Jesus' day looked at their whole history as they had it in their scriptures. For this, we need a rough timeline, a rough sense of the sequence of events, which go back, of course, to Abraham, to Moses, to David and Solomon. Then, in a sense, our story really starts when Assyria took the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, the northern tribes, in 722 BC, leaving just Judah and Benjamin with some residual Levites ministering in the temple and so on. The Judean monarchy then lasted until the Babylonians invaded and destroyed the temple in 587 BC, resulting in a 70-year exile in Babylon. Most of the people went to Babylon, not all of them came back, and indeed from that day to this, the Jews have been scattered around the world. But in 539 or 538 BC, Cyrus, the new king over Persia, conquered Babylon, and as part of his reforms, he, to everyone's astonishment, restored Judea and gave orders for the city of Jerusalem to be rebuilt and for the temple to be refounded and so on. However, that whole period that we often think of as the post-exilic period was by no means as delightful as people had imagined it was going to be. And it was a full century or so before Ezra and Nehemiah's reforms involving the rebuilding of the city walls and the re-establishment of people trying to live under the law. And even Ezra and Nehemiah complain that though we're back in our own land, we are still slaves. And so it continued. They were under Persian rule, and then after Alexander the great Macedonian monarch in the 330s, conquered the whole of the Middle East, including conquering Palestine in 332, the Jews in Palestine were living then under Greek rule. After Alexander's death, his kingdom was divided and different monarchies sprang up, leading particularly to the Egyptian predominance from 320 till roughly 200 BC, and then the dominance of Syria from 200 to the middle of the 2nd century BC. One of the most defining and important events in Jewish history then took place when Antiochus Epiphanes, the Syrian megalomaniac king, decided he was going to stamp his authority on these recalcitrant Jews by taking Jerusalem, 167, desecrating the temple, precipitating a crisis when Judas Maccabeus and his family planned a rebellion which eventually, astonishingly, was successful in 164 with the cleansing of the temple, thus establishing the Maccabean house, who became the Hasmonean dynasty, as a royal house for the next century or so. Until then, the Romans came on the scene with famously the invasion of Pompey in Jerusalem in 63, when Pompey marched into the temple and came out declaring that they didn't have a god there. He was expecting to find an idol, an image of the god. And so he wondered if maybe the Jews were atheists. And so the Jews lived under Roman rule for the succeeding years, the most important event in the following period being the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, resulting in the civil wars of the Roman world and the rise of Augustus, Julius Caesar's adopted successor, who then became emperor effectively in 27 BC, ruling the whole Roman world until 14 AD. In the middle of all that, Herod the Great, who had been simply a local warlord in the Middle East, was recognized by the Romans as the most effective warlord around, and so they gave him the title of King of the Jews, and he, of course, was ruling in Judea and quite a bit of Galilee at the time when Jesus himself was born, which was roughly 4 BC, which was roughly when Herod finally died. Jesus then lived through until more or less 30 AD. The exact date of the crucifixion is debated, by which time Tiberius, Augustus's heir and successor, had become emperor. He ruled from 14 to 37 AD. During the 40s and 50s, the best known early Christian event is the mission of Paul around what we call Turkey and Greece. Paul probably died in Rome in the early or the middle 60s, around the same time we assume as Peter also was put to death in Rome under the Emperor Nero. And then the most disastrous and cataclysmic moment in all Jewish history was the war between the Romans and the Jews, which lasted from 66 till 70 AD, ending with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70, and then the follow-up destruction of the last remaining rebels on Masada in 73. Judaism then had to reconstitute itself, but there were still other movements of revolt to come. When the Emperor Trajan tried to do various things which the Jews objected to, there was a revolt about which sadly we don't know very much, but it was 115 to 117 AD, more or less. And then when Hadrian became emperor, he decided he was going to try and deal with these Jews once and for all by promulgating legislation forbidding circumcision, among other things. And this precipitated the last great revolt under Simeon ben Kozibar, who was hailed as Bar Kokhba, son of the star, by Rabbi Akiba. And his revolt lasted for 3 years, from 132 to 135, a 3-year period not totally unlike the time of Jesus, when for 3 years many Jews believed that the kingdom of God was at last being inaugurated and that God was at last going to overthrow the hated Romans and do the new thing which they'd been waiting for. But then the Romans came and killed Bar Kokhba and destroyed his regime, and that was that. And in that period, of course, the early Christian church was starting to discover what its mission was, what its life was really going to be like. And by the time we get to the middle of the 2nd century, we find a very confused world, but one shaped by these formational, foundational events, the Jewish memory of their story, and in the middle of it, the fact of Jesus crucified and risen, and a whole new reality launched upon the world.